The list had 11 clauses, and the Duke of Ashcombe read them all before he looked up to see whether she meant to sign. Margaret Ashworth sat across the desk, with the pen already dipped, ink beating at its point, and she did not yet know that the hand holding it would be remembered, a year and a season from that afternoon, for setting the pen down rather than for anything it wrote. Had she known, she would have set it down all the same. The room smelled of beeswax and old paper and, faintly, of the cedar he kept in the wardrobe 2 rooms distant, and outside the window a thrush was working through the same 4 notes it had used since dawn, indifferent to contracts. Item the first, he read, a wife shall govern the household accounts under her husband's final review. Item the second, she shall receive callers on Tuesdays and no other day, that his own hours not be disturbed. He read on, level and unhurried, a man reading a lease rather than a life, until he reached item the 11th, which said that affection, where it arose, was to be considered an incidental blessing and not a term of the agreement, since the agreement required none. Margaret had come to Ashcombe Court poor, 26 years old, and entirely aware that a duke did not advertise for a wife the way a man advertised for a land agent, unless something in his circumstances was more pressing than his heart. She had been told the whole of it by his aunt, Lady Adeline, 3 days before, that the old duke's will required Alaric Fenwick to marry before his 30th birthday, which fell with the autumn quarter day, or see the greater part of the estate's income pass by entail to his cousin Edmund, that the Duke wanted, in consequence, not a romance, but a transaction, conducted quickly and without illusions on either side, and that Margaret, gentle-born but ruined in circumstance, clever with figures and unlikely to weep over the wording, had been thought suitable. "I do not ask for love, madam," he said, setting the paper flat before her and turning it so the last clause faced her rather than himself. "I ask for accuracy. Then you will have the truth, your grace," she said. "That is the one thing I have never falsified." He watched her for a moment, the stillness of a man taking the measure of a stranger without letting his face report what he found. "You may take the pen," he said. "It is only ink." She looked at the 11 clauses a second time, at the neat black hand in which someone had written down what a woman was for, and she set the pen back in its stand, the nib turned away from the page, as carefully as if she were laying down a knife. "I find I cannot sign what I have not yet lived," she said. "You have described a wife. You have not yet met one." Something crossed his face and was gone before it could be named, gone the way a held breath goes when a door shuts somewhere else in the house. "The pen is there," he said, "whenever you want it." She rose, thanked him for the tea she had not drunk, and left the unsigned paper on the desk between them, and neither of them said what both of them understood, which was that the season had a fixed end, that Michaelmas would come whether the ink came with it or not, and that somewhere in the house a cousin who stood to inherit everything the Duke did not secure by that date had already begun, very quietly, to count the weeks. He did not send her away. That alone told her something. 3 days later, Lady Adeline installed her at Ashcombe Court, not as a bride, but by the polite fiction both parties agreed to maintain before the servants, as a companion brought in to assist with the household books, while His Grace and Miss Ashworth determined whether they suited. It was Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, gray and blunt and 30 years in the house, who met her at the side door with a candle and no ceremony at all. "So you're the one who wouldn't sign, Mrs." Pruitt said, looking her up and down the way a woman looks at a horse she is asked to price. "I am the one who wouldn't sign yet," Margaret said. "There's a difference." "There is," said Mrs. Pruitt, "and it is the only sensible thing anyone has said in this house in a fortnight. Come in before the damp gets your hem." Over the following days, Margaret learned the shape of the household the way she had always learned things, sideways, through ledgers and servants' faces, rather than through anything said to her directly. She learned that the old Duke had died 4 years past, that his son had come home from the war changed and quiet, that the estate's cousin, Mistress Edmund Fenwick, had managed the accounts competently enough that no one thought to look behind his figures, and that the Duke himself, for all his coldness of contract, worked his own hands raw at things a Duke need not touch, mending fences, walking his own boundary lines, keeping company with tenants who had known him as a boy. It was in the estate office, on her 4th evening, that he found her bent over the quarter accounts with a private thoroughness no one had asked of her. "You were not required to do that tonight," he said. "I was not required to do a great many things," she said, not looking up. "I find I do them regardless. It appears to be a fault in my character." He came around to see what she had found, and she showed him, plainly, a column of figures that balanced on the page and did not balance in her head, a small, persistent discrepancy in the tenant rents that someone had smoothed over rather than explained. "It is likely nothing," she said. "Ledgers are full of small untidiness that means only that a clerk was tired. It is only that I notice untidiness the way other people notice weather. Then you will be useful to me," he said, and there was, for a moment, something almost like warmth in it, quickly folded away. "My father kept books," she said, "before I thought better of offering it. He taught me to read a column the way other girls were taught to read music." "Was," the Duke repeated, catching the tense. She had not meant to leave the door so far open. "He was a steward," she said carefully. "He is dead now. I do not speak of him easily." "Then I will not ask you to," he said, and tapped 2 fingers once on the desk, a small closing gesture, as though he had shut a drawer on the subject out of courtesy rather than in curiosity. She thanked him for it and did not tell him that the steward she meant and the estate he had kept books for was not so distant from the one they stood in as he believed. Edmund Fenwick was, by every account she was given before she met him, a most agreeable man, and she found, on meeting him, that the account was accurate and that the agreeableness itself was the first thing that troubled her. He had his cousin's coloring and none of his stillness, a ready smile, a voice pitched always a half-tone gentler than the room required. "Miss Ashworth," he said, bowing over her hand in the long gallery, as though they had been introduced at a ball rather than in a corridor. "I have heard you are clever with figures. I hope you will forgive me if I confess the estate's books are rather my particular pride. I should hate to think a stranger found them wanting. I am sure I shall find nothing but good order, Miss Fenwick," she said. "Order is precisely what I hope for," he said, and straightened his cuffs, one and then the other, a small, precise tidying that she would come to know as his only tell, and smiled at her in a way that did not reach any part of his face below the eyes. "It would be a pity," he added, "if a lady so recently arrived formed opinions on figures she has not had time to understand fully. Books are deceptive things to the untrained eye. I have been trained since I was a child, sir," she said. "Then we shall have no misunderstandings at all," he said, and left her with the distinct sense of having been warned in the gentlest possible words. Below stairs, the household had already begun to place its wagers, as households will, on whether the cold Duke would go through with a match so plainly built of arithmetic rather than affection. Callers came from 3 neighboring houses that week alone, ostensibly to pay respects to Lady Adeline, and actually to look at the companion who had, by report, refused to sign a contract read to her like a lease. Margaret bore the looking with the same composure she brought to everything, and in the estate office that Thursday, cross-referencing 5 years of harvest returns against the rent rolls, Because the small untidiness she had noticed would not leave her alone, she found a second discrepancy, smaller than the first, in a different hand, dated to a season when, by the ledger's own admission, no harvest had been taken in at all. She copied the figures into her own small book before she thought better of it, in a private notation her father had taught her, numbers keyed to the calendar of household saints' days rather than to any cipher a stranger could read, and she told no one, not yet, filing it away the way she had learned. Very young to file away anything that might later need to be proven rather than merely believed. The work drew them together in a manner neither of them had contracted for. By the second week, they sat most evenings on opposite sides of the same table, the estate's books between them like a country they were mapping in company, and she found that the Duke's silences, which the county called coldness, were in fact a kind of careful economy, a man who had learned during the war to spend words the way a soldier spends ammunition, only where they would tell. "You are frowning at the sheep returns," he observed one evening, without looking up from his own page. "I am frowning at your steward's arithmetic," she said. "He rounds every figure to the nearest convenient number. It offends me on principle. Edmund has always preferred a tidy page to an exact one," he said. "I confess I have never minded it. You should mind it," she said. "A tidy page and an honest page are not the same animal, Your Grace, though they are often mistaken for cousins." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite permitted to become a smile. "My father used to say something very like that," he said, "about cousins, or about honesty." "About both," he said, and for the first time since she had known him, he laughed, briefly, almost against his will. A low sound quickly recovered, but not quickly enough to be unheard. She marked it the way she marked her ledgers. In a private column of her own, the Duke of Ashcombe had laughed, on the 11th evening, over sheep returns, and she found she wanted to hear it again more than she wanted almost anything the contract had offered her. It was in that same warmth, unguarded for once, that she gave him the first true coin of her secret, though not the whole of it. "My father was dismissed from a great house," she told him, "for a theft he did not commit. That is why I know ledgers as I do. I spent my girlhood trying to find, in numbers, the exoneration no one troubled to look for. I am sorry," he said, and meant it plainly. "Which house?" She looked at the candle rather than at him. "That," she said, "I am not yet ready to tell you. There is a shape to it I have not finished proving, and I would rather bring you a fact than a grievance." He did not press her, though she saw that he wanted to, and he said only, "Then I will wait for the fact," in a voice that told her he understood exactly what it cost a person to withhold a card at a table where trust was the only currency either of them had agreed to deal in. The blow, when it came, arrived dressed as concern. Edmund Fenwick requested a private word with his cousin on a morning when the light through the gallery windows lay flat and merciless across the floor, and Margaret, coming down the passage to return a book to the estate office, heard her own name before she heard the door, and stopped, out of a self-preservation older than manners, with her hand on the frame. "I would not raise it if I were not fond of you, Alaric," Edmund was saying. His voice pitched at its gentlest register, which she had already learned to distrust more than any shout. "But Miss Ashworth has been remarkably industrious among the accounts for a woman who arrived with nothing. I found, only yesterday, that a sum from the autumn rents does not reconcile, and that she alone has had unsupervised hours with that ledger. I do not say she has taken anything. I say only that a clever woman with a ruined name and an empty purse is precisely the sort of person who could, and that you owe it to the estate and to the memory of your father to look plainly rather than fondly." There was a silence on the other side of the door long enough that Margaret's pulse counted it for her. "And if I look plainly," the Duke said at last, his voice very quiet, "and find nothing." "Then you will have lost an afternoon, and I will apologize to her myself," Edmund said. "But if you find something, cousin, better you find it now, before the ring is on her hand and the name is Fenwick, and the scandal is ours to keep rather than hers to carry away." Margaret did not wait to hear the rest. She had spent her whole life reading what people did not say, and what she had just heard, beneath the concern, was a man who had known exactly which ledger to point at, because he had put the discrepancy there himself, and had done it with her own diligence as the instrument, so that the very competence she had brought to prove her worth had been turned, in a single conversation, into the evidence against her. She went back to her room and sat a long while, with her hands flat on her knees, steadying them the way she had once steadied them as a girl, watching bailiffs carry her father's chairs into the yard, and she thought, with a clarity that frightened her more than the accusation had, that she was not looking at carelessness now. She was looking at the same hand that had ruined her father, 8 years distant and one great house removed, still at its old trade, and that the estate she had come to for a contract had been, without her knowing it until this hour, the very house that owed her a debt older than any marriage settlement. The reckoning she had dreaded came that same evening, though it wore at first the shape of mercy rather than accusation. Alaric summoned her to the study, the same room, the same desk, and she saw before he spoke that he had not slept on the matter easily. There was a stillness in him that was not his ordinary stillness, but something closer to a man holding a wound shut with one hand. "I have found an irregularity in the autumn accounts," he said. "I am obliged to ask you plainly whether you can account for it." "I can account for a great many irregularities in this house's books, your grace," she said, "and this is not the first. But I did not make this one, and I think you already suspect who did." He did not answer that directly, which told her more than an answer would have. "I am prepared to be generous," he said instead. "A sum, quietly settled, and a character reference that names no fault, if you would prefer to withdraw from this arrangement before it becomes a subject for the county to chew on. No one need know more than that the match did not suit." It was, she understood, the kindest cruelty he knew how to offer, an exit dressed as rescue, and she felt the whole of her poverty pressing against the back of the offer, the years of make-do, the empty purse Edmund had named so accurately as her weakness. She thought of her father, who had been offered something very like it once, a quiet resignation instead of a public trial, and had refused it because a resignation is a kind of confession, and he had done nothing to confess. "I will not take your money to disappear quietly," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands, out of his sight, had found the edge of her skirt and gripped it. "If I go, I will go accused, in the open, where the accusation can be answered. I would rather be ruined honestly than saved dishonestly, your grace. That is not generosity you are offering me. It is a bribe with better manners." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face suggested the offer had cost him more to make than she credited, and would cost him more still to watch her refuse. "Then you leave me no gentle way to manage this," he said. "I did not come here for a gentle way," she said. "I came for the truth, though it appears I shall have to go and fetch it myself." She left the study with her spine straight and her reputation, by the time she reached the stairs, already a half-day's gossip ahead of her, and Mrs. Pruitt met her on the landing with a candle and a face gone hard with fury on her behalf. "They'll dismiss you before the week's out," the housekeeper said, "unless someone finds the truth of it first." "Then someone had better find it," Margaret said, "and I believe I know exactly where to look, because I have been looking for it, in one house or another, for 8 years. She was given until the end of the week to remove herself, a mercy of timing rather than of spirit, and it was in that narrowed window, with her trunk half packed and her name already spoken in 3 sitting rooms she had never entered, that Mrs. Pruitt came to her after midnight with a candle shielded in her palm and a look Margaret had not yet seen on her. "There's a thing in the old counting house I ought to have given you the day you came, if I'd had the sense to know who you were," the housekeeper said. "I knew your father, Miss Halloway." Margaret's own name, spoken aloud for the first time in that house, struck her like cold water. "I go by Ashworth now," she said. "My mother's name." "I did not think anyone here would remember. I remembered the day he was carried out of this house with his name in ruins and his own books used against him," said Mrs. Pruitt, "and I never believed a word of what they said of him, not one word, because I dusted that counting house for 11 years, and I know an honest man's hand from a false one. He left something behind the loose stone by the ledger press before they turned him out. I was afraid to touch it. I am not afraid now." What she pressed into Margaret's hands was a small, worn notebook, its cover soft with handling, filled in her father's own private hand, the numbers keyed not to any cipher a stranger could break, but to the calendar of household saints' days he had taught his daughter as a girl, thinking it a game. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and translated it by candlelight with fingers that would not quite stop trembling, and what emerged, column by patient column, was not a confession but an accusation, years old, aimed precisely at the young under-steward who had taken his place, a record of sums that left the estate by one road and never arrived by the other, kept safe against the day someone might need to be believed. It was not proof by itself. A dead man's private book could be called forgery as easily as anything else. But it was a map, and it pointed, with her father's own careful patience, directly at a second ledger that must still exist somewhere in this house, the true book kept alongside the false one. Because men who steal by inches for years do not trust their memories, they trust their arithmetic, and arithmetic must be written down somewhere to be believed even by the man who wrote it. She was still turning the pages when a folded paper slipped from between 2 leaves and opened on her knee, and on it, in a hand she did not recognize, but would come to know within a fortnight, as belonging to a frightened young clerk named Simon Hobb, was a single line asking her father's forgiveness for something the writer had been made to do and had never had the courage to undo. She did not leave at the end of the week. She went instead, before dawn on the 6th day, to the one man in the county with no interest to serve but the truth, Mr. Josiah Pierce, the family's own solicitor, a spare and exacting man who had drawn up the old Duke's will himself, and who listened to her translated ledger and her father's story with the stillness of a man weighing evidence rather than a woman's grief. "This is not proof, Miss Ashworth," he said at last, not unkindly, "but it is a very great deal of smoke for there to be no fire beneath it, and I find I am willing to help you look for the fire, if His Grace consents to a proper search of the counting house before the quarter-day rents are gathered, as is his right." The Duke, when Margaret came to him with Pierce beside her, rather than alone, listened to the whole of it with a face that gave away nothing until she reached the part concerning her father's name, at which his composure broke for the first time she had witnessed, not into anger, but into something rawer. "Thomas Holloway," he said slowly. "I was a boy of 16 when he was dismissed. I remember him. He taught me to ride a bad-tempered gray gelding my own groom had given up on. I remember thinking, even then, that the charge did not suit the man." "You never said so," she said. "I was 16, he said, and my father believed his own steward's figures, and I had not yet learned that gentleness in a voice is not the same as honesty in a hand. He looked at her a long moment, weighing what it had cost her to come to him with this, rather than simply vanish with her wound, and something in his face settled, decided, the way a man settles an account he has been carrying unpaid too long. "We will not wait for McElmis to do this properly," he said. "We will gather the tenants for the quarter day as arranged, and Edmund with them, and Pierce, and whoever else the truth requires, and we will open that counting house in the daylight, before witnesses, because I have learned in this house that a private reckoning only ever protects the guilty." That evening, walking the boundary wall where he still went to think, he found Edmund waiting for him with his cuffs already straightened twice in as many minutes, a tell Margaret had taught him to watch for, and though Alaric said nothing of what he knew, he saw for the first time a flicker of true unease cross his cousin's practiced calm, quickly smoothed, not quickly enough. The quarter day gathered more of the county than any rent day in memory, though the true business of it was known to perhaps 4 people when the tenants filed into the long gallery to see their leases settled, and Margaret stood near the window with her father's small book held against her side like something that might yet be taken from her again. Pierce called the roll of business in his flat legal voice, and when the ordinary matters were concluded, he did not sit down. "There is one further item," he said, "before this quarter's business is closed, concerning the estate's accounts for the seasons now some 8 years past, and I must ask Mr. Edmund Fenwick to remain." Edmund's smile did not waver, though his hand went once, briefly, to his cuff. "I am entirely at your disposal," he said. "Then perhaps," said Alaric, stepping forward, "you will help us account for a second ledger, kept alongside the first, that does not match it." "There is no second ledger," Edmund said, and his voice was still gentle, still perfectly pitched. But Margaret, who had spent her life reading faces the law could not yet read, saw the small tightening at the corner of his eye that told her he had just told the one lie too many. "Then it will cost us nothing to look," Pierce said, and it was Mrs. Pruitt, of all people, who produced the loose stone's twin from the counting-house wall, a leather book bound in the same hand as the false ledger everyone had trusted for 8 years, its true figures matching, column for column, saint's day for saint's day, the accusations written in her father's private notation. Margaret read them aloud herself, her voice steady, though her hands were not, translating each entry into the plain arithmetic of theft. Sums that left one column and never arrived in the other, year upon year, always in a season when the harvest ledger, conveniently, showed some small misfortune to explain the shortfall. It was Simon Hobb, brought forward white-faced by Pierce's own clerk, who broke the matter entirely open, and it took only one question to do it. "Who told you to write false figures in your master's hand, Mr. Hobb?" Pierce asked him, quietly, and the young man's composure, thin as ice on a spring pond, went through all at once. "Mr. Edmund did, sir," he said, the words coming out of him like something long damned. "He said Mr. Holloway would take the blame, that he was old and tired and would be believed guilty because he was poor, and that I would lose my place, and worse if I did not do as he asked. I have carried it 8 years. I wrote him a letter of it once, meaning to confess, and never had the courage to send it. It is in the old man's book, sir. I put it there myself, hoping someone honest would find it before I died a coward." Edmund's own letters, produced at last from among Hobb's kept papers, instructing the young clerk in his own unmistakable hand exactly which figures to alter and exactly which innocent man to let the blame fall upon, were read aloud in that gallery in a silence so complete that Margaret could hear, through the open window, the same thrush that had sung outside the study on the day she would not sign the contract. Edmund Fenwick did not shout, and he did not run. He stood very still, his cuffs at last left crooked, and when he spoke again his gentle voice had gone thin and old. "I only ever wanted what was owed me," he said. I was raised beside him, told from the cradle I was second, watched him inherit a name I could have carried better, and I told myself a little was no theft at all, only a correction of an old unfairness. I did not mean for Holloway to die of it. I have never once, in 8 years, stopped seeing his face. For a moment, the gallery saw not a villain, but a tired, aging man undone by an old envy grown monstrous through neglect, and Margaret, who had come there for justice, found she could not summon hatred to match it, only a great and unexpected pity. "It is not for me to try you," Alaric said at last, into the stillness. "That is a magistrate's office, and Mr. Pierce will see the law satisfied where the law is owed satisfaction. But I will say this before these witnesses, that Simon Hobb, who confessed freely and unprompted, will keep his place and his character, because a frightened boy made to lie is not the same creature as the man who frightened him. And you, cousin, will have an allowance sufficient to live quietly, somewhere distant from this county, on the single condition that you trouble neither this family nor Miss Ashworth's name again, because I find I would rather protect the innocent from further scandal than spend my satisfaction on your ruin. It is not kindness to you. It is mercy to everyone you have not yet finished harming." Edmund Fenwick was led away within the hour, and the tenants who had come only to see their leases signed went home with a story that would outlast any of the leases, and Margaret stood a long while by the window, with her father's small book, warm from her own hands, watching the light move across the gallery floor exactly as it had the day the accusation first fell on him, and thought that some doors, once opened honestly, could finally be allowed to close. It was 3 evenings later, the counting-house quiet again, and the county's talk already turning, as county talk will, toward the next scandal, that Alaric found her in the estate office where it had all begun, the old unsigned contract still, absurdly, in the bottom drawer where no one had thought to burn it. "I have been thinking of a wife's duties," he said, drawing it out and setting it on the desk between them as he had that first afternoon. "I find I no longer wish to write any of them down." "Then, what do you wish, Your Grace?" she asked, though she thought she already knew. "I wish to ask you something with no clause attached to it, and no deadline behind it either, since my Kelmus will come and go now, whether we marry on that day or any other, the estate's income being no longer any cousins to inherit out from under me. Marry me, Margaret, because you wish it, and for no other reason, since it is the only reason I will accept. I do not ask you to be accurate. I ask you only to stay." She looked at the blank contract a long moment, then took it up, not to sign it, but to feed it, page by page, into the small fire burning in the grate, watching the 11 clauses curl and blacken and go to nothing. "I keep an honest book," she said, when the last of it was ash. "I have told you that from the first evening. If I stay, it will not be because a paper asked me to. It will be because I choose to enter it in my own hand, freely, with nothing owed on either side. Then take the pen," he said. And this time there was no list beside it, only a single blank sheet, and beneath it, her father's old ledger set carefully on the desk where it would be kept from that day forward among the estate's own records, no longer hidden, no longer a wound, but simply a fact restored to its rightful column. The pen was there, exactly where it had been that first afternoon, and this time she picked it up at once. They were married quietly that autumn, before Michaelmas rather than because of it, in the small stone church at the edge of the park, with Mrs. Pruitt weeping openly in the second pew and swearing before 3 neighbors that she had known it would come to this from the very first week. And with Lady Delphine Cray, who had once been spoken of as the likelier match, and who had, in the difficult days of the accusation, been the first among the county's ladies to say plainly that she did not believe a word of it, standing witness with a grace that earned her, within the year, a dignified and happier engagement of her own to a quieter man who suited her better than a duke ever would have. Simon Hobb kept his place in the estate office, and kept, too, a habit of visiting the small stone in the churchyard, where Thomas Holloway's name was at last cut properly, without qualification, restored by his own daughter's hand and the estate's public acknowledgment of the wrong it had allowed. Edmund Fenwick lived out his years in a distant county on the allowance he had been granted, writing, in his final winter, a single unanswered letter of apology that Margaret read once, quietly, and forgave without troubling to reply, because some debts are settled simply by being no longer owed. A year turned, and then a season more, and on a warm morning very like the one on which she had first climbed the steps of Ashcombe Court, Margaret sat once again at the desk in the estate office, a different book open before her now, this one recording not a wife's duties but the name of a daughter born that spring, and Alaric came in to find her writing, unhurried, the thrush singing its same 4 notes in the yew hedge outside the window, as though no time at all had passed. He did not read her a list this time. He only leaned against the doorframe and watched her hand move steadily across the page, and when she looked up he said, "You are frowning at your arithmetic again." And she said, "I am only making certain the entry is accurate, Your Grace." And he laughed. The real laugh she had first heard over the sheep returns years before, entirely unguarded now. A thing she had long since stopped counting as a milestone, because it came so often it was simply the sound of their house. If this quiet story of a stubborn ledger, an unsigned contract, and a name finally set right has warmed you the way an old flame warms a cold room, come sit by the fire a while longer. Because there is always a chair kept for anyone who still believes an honest book is worth keeping, even when no one is watching. Tell me, in the glow of your own hearth, which moment stayed with you longest? The pen set down, the loose stone in the counting-house wall, or the one precise question that finally broke a silence 8 years old? And if you would like to be here the next time a story like this one is told, keep a place for yourself among the regulars of Fireside and Feather, so the candle is already lit when you return. Sleep well tonight, and be gentle, as gentleness was owed to a poor man's daughter, with anyone still waiting quietly for someone to open the right drawer and believe them.